Welcome back, guys. I am Follygon, and in today's Sculptober video we are going to be working on the prompt Storm. And who better to create with that prompt than Marvel's very own. Before we get in and talk about the process though, click that subscribe button if you're new around here. And if you're looking for things like my brushes or materials, check out gumroad.com/Follygon. So in this one, I wanted to focus a lot of our time on hair. These are daily sculpts, and because of that, I never really have a ton of time to fully flesh out a full realized character. Those take quite a bit of time. For most of my 2D to 3D videos where I'm creating full characters, those are at least taking 50 hours to complete, sometimes more than that. I thought it was really funny. Recently, I saw a video from Jazza, Draw with Jazza, if you guys are familiar with the YouTube channel, showing off a diorama that took over 100 hours to create. And I think the purpose of that title is, to show off how big of a number that is. Like, oh wow, 100 hours, that's so much. But for me as a digital sculptor, I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's pretty normal. Sometimes it could be hundreds of hours depending on the project. But here in a single day, I typically only have about 3 hours max to work on these. This one in particular took 2 hours to complete, and with most of the focus being on the hair, which we'll get to here in just a moment. But before we get in and focus on the hair, I need to create the base for the character that hair is going to go on. I keep this all extremely simple. I originally wasn't even going to give it facial features, but I thought that the mannequin would look pretty awkward without it, so I at least sketched on the basic planes of the face. So basic area for the eyes, for the nose, creating the basic form changes for that area. Most of this was super quick and super simple. I didn't even give the character a mouth, as it was kind of secondary to what I was going to be doing here. For every single day of Sculptober, there is a different prompt, and with that, of course, I'm creating tons of different stuff in different styles, and with each video, I want to try to focus on different topics. So that means that I have to sacrifice in some areas simply because of time constraints. For what I do create with the body, it's just a simple kind of triangular bust shape that I create there, that I create everything on top of for the clothing, all very simple, trying to keep it nice and clean. I even keep the anatomical form to a minimum, so you can see me starting to get in some of the muscles of the neck, as well as some of the additional form up underneath the chin, and some of that kind of connective area there, but for the most part, I keep it extremely simple. Now adding the ear onto the head, just using a previous ear that I've made in the past that I have converted into a brush, specifically an IMM brush or an insert multi-mesh. You can add all sorts of fun stuff to those. I have one for an animal ear, I have one for a cartoon style ear, and then I have one for the ear that I just inserted there. I have a bunch of other ones as well for adding things like collars, hands, feet, all sorts of stuff. They're really useful, and I highly encourage people to check them out if you've never heard of them. So I used my cube tube brush to create the collar and the flap of the jacket, and now I'm using masks and extractions to create the rest of the clothing. So the base form for the jacket, as well as the shirt underneath. Then a simple sphere appended for the eyeball. Like I said, I wasn't originally even going to add this stuff, but I felt like the mannequin without any facial features felt a little odd. But honestly, I think it probably would have been fine simply because I didn't have the hair in at this point, so it was feeling a bit bland, and it didn't really matter too much in the end, as most of our focus for the render is going to be on the hair. I even give the head a little turn, so anything on the face that we can see is pretty minimal anyway. So normally when I create eyelids and eyelashes and all this stuff, I spend quite a bit of time creating some really hyper clean forms, especially when we're talking about eyes. That kind of area you want to keep nice and clean. This time around, I just sketched it on with a Damien standard brush to create the basic form of the eyelid, and then I just pulled that out with a move brush. Typically, I wouldn't do that because it is a very messy way to do things, and if you want to get more control, I recommend using something like a curve brush, like my cube tube brush. I use that quite a lot for creating eyelids. Wrapping it around the form of an eyeball is a great way to get that geometry heading in the right direction and keeping it super clean. So now we're moving on to the hair, and we're gonna start with just the simple basic form of the mohawk. As soon as I pull that shape out, I immediately break symmetry on it, keeping it as low poly and kind of messy at this stage as possible. Not really worried about things being super perfect or anything like that, more so just trying to get something in place so that I can begin working with it. After I have the basic shape there for the single piece of geometry, I then take that geometry and I begin cutting it up into smaller chunks. So I am using the slice curve brush right now to achieve that effect, and then on all the chopped off pieces of geometry that I'm creating, I'm simply separating those, dynameshing them by themselves, and then later on I'll kind of play with those to clean them up a little bit more. I also remesh them to lower the poly count to create something a bit easier to work with. I always say that the less polygons you have, the easier it is to manipulate them. And that is just objectively true. The less polys you have, the easier it is to manipulate. You can see me now creating some of those few front pieces there and then lowering the poly count even further just so I can get something a bit easier to manipulate. I then start using things like my move brush with backface masking to manually inflate areas. The inflate brush can be nice for this, but if you want even more control, I recommend looking into move with backface masking. And then I am using my mask lasso tool and the transpose line to squash, stretch, and rotate different parts of that hair to begin getting it a little bit of that form to flow back towards the back of the head. And then I'm looking at this from every possible angle. As a 3D artist, it takes a lot more work than if you're working on something for 2D, right? Kind of work on it from every single angle, make it look great from every single angle. With 2D, you're only looking at one, so you can focus on that quite a bit more, really honing in on that silhouette. But in 3D, that silhouette has to look nice and read well from every possible angle. So you can see that I'm looking at this top-down angle quite often to make sure that things are kind of lining up in a nice way. They're not all kind of going the exact same direction. I'm making sure that I'm getting some offset there, just making that more visually interesting. I highly encourage you 3D artists out there to look at your form from really extreme angles. So that means looking at things from top down, bottom up, that kind of stuff, to make sure that things aren't, sneaking past you. If you're kind of just looking at the same angle forever, you can start to work on that too long, and then you'll rotate to the side and realize that everything is completely broken from that one particular view. And because you weren't paying attention to all those different angles, it can kind of sneak past you. Now I'm moving on to adding a little bit more form to the hair. For this, I am using my sharp, soft brush. This is a great brush for just adding some additional form onto hair. I use it for that quite often. I use it for a lot of different things. But if you don't have my particular brush, you can get it over on my Gumroad. There's a link down below. Or you could use an alternative brush that comes with ZBrush. The standard brush, you could probably get a similar effect, or maybe a softer Damien standard, or something like the inflate brush might be able to get you pretty close if you want to get that similar kind of effect. There's a lot of different brushes here in ZBrush, but for the most part, I don't really use too many. I keep it to a minimum in terms of actual brushes that I use. If you're more interested in those, like I said, you can see them at the bottom of the screen or check them out at the link below. A lot of what I'm doing right now is just trying to hit every single piece of hair before I begin adding on additional form. I really want to make sure that the initial shape that I'm creating for the silhouette is nice and strong. Taking a look back at this, that one piece at the back of the head is sticking out super far. That originally was intentional because I wanted to bring more hair into that. Right now I think it looks pretty awkward, but for the final render, for the final mesh that I create, I think it gets fixed quite a bit. But right now at least it looks and feels a bit too prominent in the silhouette, especially for something that's on the back of the head. You want to keep that kind of stuff more towards the front or more towards your point of interest. On a character, that is typically the face. You wouldn't want to put something extremely visually interesting at the back of the head unless you really wanted to pull attention to that area. Going back over the hair now, again with the sharp soft brush to create some more form, while also just making sure that I'm keeping things nice and clean and sharp, and tapering in a way that makes a little bit more sense. Some of the ends of my hair were a little bit too thick, so I needed to sharpen a lot of that up and just start to get some secondary form in each of these strokes or tubes of geometry to make them feel a bit more like hair. It's very easy for hair created with this technique to begin feeling a little awkward, kind of feeling like, spaghetti or something like that. So that's why it's really a good idea to get a lot of larger chunks, a lot of smaller chunks, and get a lot of variety there in terms of shape, size, direction, everything. The more you get of that, the more visually interesting the form is going to be, and the less it's going to look like spaghetti, which is typically very good unless you are maybe creating something like a flying spaghetti monster. So continuing to go about that process, you'll notice that I'm still using things like my mask brush, my move brush, and the transpose line, all to kind of work with the form. So even as I'm going through and creating secondary shapes, it's really important to understand that at any point in this process, if you need to take a step back to kind of correct something in the silhouette, work on that primary form, it's totally okay to do that. So if you rush ahead, sometimes you just need to take a step backwards. Speaking on that, exactly right now, I just fixed the back of that one strand of hair that I said was sticking out really far and felt super awkward. So I've corrected that, and now we're going through and just making the hair a little bit more volumetric, a little bit larger, and focusing on now starting to get in some smaller pieces. So for this, I end up using the curve tube snap brush, and I've adjusted the curve so that it goes from a larger to a smaller stroke. And now I'm just drawing that over a few specific areas of the hair where I want to add a bit more visual interest. For the most part towards the ends of the hair, but some of these are a little bit closer to the base as well. Just trying to add a little bit more variety to some of this form. And then I'm going back through and starting to kind of get those pieces to weave in and out of the hair in a way that makes visual sense, while creating visual interest in some of those specific areas. For the most part, I wanted to break up the silhouette a little bit more, so you can see me starting to use my mask and move brush to adjust those, get those reading a little bit more from the profile, as that is the angle that I'm going to be rendering the final piece from. But you can also see me starting to get some of those pieces towards the base, just to add a little more visual interest to some of the larger chunks where it felt a little bit more flat. So I want to be careful with my distribution of these small details. If you start adding too many of those on top of what you already have, it's very easy to go back towards the spaghetti direction that we were talking about before, simply because you've broken it up so much that everything is high detail, and then your eyes have no idea where to look. It's just a jumbled mess of tubes, and everything starts to kind of read exactly the same. So if you're gonna have high detailed areas, just be careful that you distribute those in a way that visually makes sense and doesn't get so busy that everything becomes a complete jumbled mess. Unless, of course, again, you're making the flying spaghetti monster. Then you can go crazy. A lot of what I'm doing now are just finishing touches, making sure that I'm taking a moment to take a step backwards, look at the form from every possible angle, see if things are kind of lining up in an awkward way from any particular view. If they are, I go back through, offset some of that form for the silhouette, make that feel a little more distinct. And as you can see, I'm making a lot of those changes right now. So a lot of little areas where it feels maybe a bit too repetitive, or maybe a couple areas where things are just lining up in a bit of an awkward way. Then on to adding just a little bit of asymmetry here. For the most part, this just includes offsetting the hood, or what would you call that? Collar, I guess. Offsetting the collar, and then doing things like rotating the head. As I mentioned, I'm going to be rendering the hair from the profile. Again, the face doesn't really matter here too much at all. It's more so just kind of focusing on creating some badass hair, which I think we did. I really enjoyed the hairstyle here, created some really cool form, and I got to show you guys some cool techniques, so hopefully you learned something new along the way. And most of the stuff from here is just some little tiny tweaks to get things feeling a bit better after I twisted that neck. So hey, if you're new around here, click that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about digital sculpting, check out gumroad.com/Follygon for all of my courses, brushes, and materials. This was day 20 of Sculptober, doing some focusing on hair. Tomorrow is day 21 with the prompt fresh, and I think I have a pretty fun idea, so come on back tomorrow and check it out. I'll see you then.